We're now in Unit 9. This is Business Continuity Planning and Disaster Recovery. Some of the topics we're going to deal with here include definitions relevant to disaster recovery and business continuity, discussion of the time criticality of information resources. In prior courses and prior slides, we've talked about risk analysis, the economics of security, and the trade-off of cost and benefit. Similar topics apply in disaster recovery. If something needs to be recovered very quickly and it is very valuable, you will spend more money doing so. If something can wait to be recovered, you can get away with spending a lot less money. Different recovery strategies, which are basically schemes for restoring system operation, the information processing services that are vital to your business. Legal requirements, where you're required, where you may or may not be required to have disaster recovery plans, and what you can do about that. How to plan a disaster recovery and business continuity project, and lastly, testing your disaster recovery plan and business continuity project. The reading here is from the textbook, The Official Guide to the CISSP Common Body of Knowledge, pages 261 to 306. That's Chapter 3. Definitions. We got business continuity plan. This is how you keep the business operating in the event of a disaster. This isn't just about recovering information technology. It's making sure that your customers are serviced, your bills are paid, your vendors are paid as well, and you can keep producing the product you do in terms of normal business operations. The disaster recovery plan, as is commonly understood, however, involves strictly keeping the critical information technology functions running. This is something that the information technology department and oftentimes information security is responsible for, though of course the conundrum is, what good does it do to keep the information technology, keeping the systems and networks running, if the rest of the business isn't there to keep operating as well? You can have your accounts receivable system working, but if there aren't people to bill and collect the bill and deposit the money, it doesn't do you a whole lot of good. Contingency planning is a broader term that refers to the combination of disaster recovery planning and business continuity planning. Contingency planning is what you do in the event that there's a disaster that shuts down either your information technology or business services, or perhaps both at the same time. A component of a disaster recovery plan and a business continuity plan is of the disaster recovery plan, you'll have to excuse me, not so much the business continuity plan, is the business impact analysis. You're looking at the time criticality of IT systems and organizational business functions to define the recovery time objectives and select a recovery strategy. When a disaster happens, every minute after a critical IT process or critical business function is shut down, it costs you money. How much money and how quickly? That's the object of the business impact analysis. If you're shut down 20 minutes, 4 hours, 2 days, what is the economic impact to your business? Because that helps determine what sort of strategy you should follow in terms of recovery. Recovery time objective. Time within which a business function must be restored after an interruption. They're sort of related to service level agreements. If you're in an environment where folks have service level agreements, that certain information technology services need to be available, at a certain percentage of the time with a certain turnaround, etc., that will help guide you in terms of recovery time objective. Though keep in mind that recovery time objective is something that relates to a more general disaster as opposed to just a simple, server not being up often enough sort of thing. More definitions. Hot standby, hot spare. We're talking about recovery strategies here. A hot standby, sometimes called a hot spare, it supports immediate component failure or remote backup data center within near real-time copies of production data. You switch over a component, a piece of equipment, or an application or a function within seconds or minutes, meaning you've got a system that's running, ready to go somewhere else, and it's just a matter of switching the communication. You'll sometimes see hot standby referred to in terms of networking components. A firewall may have a hot standby, or some other stateful device. Web servers may have hot standby, so that if server A fails, server B immediately switches in, and the folks using your web services don't know that they're operating off of a standby system. It just sort of happens seamlessly. Hot site, is the next. The hot standby and hot spare is the sort of recovery option that recovers the most quickly and typically costs the most as well. Next on the list is a hot site. It's a ready-to-run duplicate of critical IT systems, including recent full backups. It's available and typically switches over in a matter of hours. If you lose your main data center, a hot site should be ready to run within a matter of hours. You've got everything in duplicate at the hot site. Oftentimes this is an option that you purchase from a hot site vendor. You have a contract that says if we declare a disaster within X number of hours, you will provide us system A, B, and C along with our available backups, and for that a certain fee they promise to give you that. A warm site is a partial duplicate of your critical IT systems. Depending on where you run into this term, there are different definitions, but I'll give you the definition here that's in the book. Warm site, a leased or rented facility that is usually partially configured with some equipment, but not the actual computers. It'll generally have all the cooling, cabling, and networks in place to accommodate the recovery, but the actual servers, mainframe, etc. equipment are delivered to the site at the time of disaster. By delivered it to the site at time of disaster means you have a contract with your primary hardware vendors saying, we will pay you X amount, and you agreed if we give you some sort of notice that you will deliver this equipment to this location within so many hours, hot off your assembly line or out of your warehouse somewhere. So that's a warm site. It's warm because you may have network connectivity, you may have cabling, you may have other sorts of infrastructure there ready to go, but the computers as well as the backup data need to be delivered. Lastly, and what is the cheapest but also takes the most amount of time and effort to bring up in a recovery mode is a cold site. Here you're just renting space. A shell of a site, space, utilities, and communication links. No equipment, nothing that's ready to go. All equipment must be shipped through prior arrangements with vendors. And a cold site is something that, once you have a disaster and make the proper declarations, it can take you a few days to get the thing up and running. So obviously, hot standby, hot spare is used for the most critical type functions, where you need systems that fail over very quickly, where the losses that occur in the event of a disaster are so high and get so high so quickly, it's worth your while to buy this sort of coverage. Hot site are for those cases where the losses become critical after a matter of hours or perhaps a day or so, where you can afford to wait 20 minutes, a half hour or so, but once it gets to be much beyond that, you really need to get the systems up and running to avoid irreparable damage to your business and great losses. Warm site, somewhat less than that, depending on your arrangements and so forth, maybe a couple days. A cold site is for the less time critical functions where, if the system is down for 5 days, people will be annoyed, but it's not business critical. And, that sounds kind of flippant, but there really are a lot of systems like that where, it may be important in the long run, but if it's down for a few days, folks will manage to survive and things will keep running. That is something where a cold site is something that's called for. Now here I'm illustrating the notion of time criticality. We've got two different curves here. You notice that the x-axis is time from the start of the outage, meaning the outage starts here, and then time slowly creeps along. This could be hours or days or whatever. And in here, this y-axis is dollars lost to the business from the outage. And you're looking at total loss. It's the loss in employee productivity, the loss in terms of not being able to collect revenue, in terms of being able to make sales, the loss in terms of penalties and inefficiencies from not being able to deal properly with vendors and customers, as well as a loss from possible regulatory fines and so forth. There's other losses. If you're dealing with financial transactions, there are time-based losses where, if you're not able to turn money over within a certain time limit, it costs you something. So we got two curves listed here. Curve A starts out here and then gets very steep very quickly. This is the sign of a business or a business process that is extremely time critical, where the curve kind of like points up, and after a rather short period of time, the losses get to be very high. Now, the opposite is the second curve here, B, where the losses kind of gradually creep up over time. These two loss curves imply different sorts of recovery strategies. The A strategy is the cases where, you might want to deal with hot standby, or at worst a hot site, where for this much cost, you can be up and running in this much time. Very little time, but very high cost. On the other hand, the process outlined in B here may not become critical until much later. And you'll notice that the cost to implement B is less. In this drawing here, it's not quite so dramatic, but there is a difference between A and B. And you'll also notice that you have a greater amount of time to recover. So if you've got a process where it follows this curve, where the losses just very gradually mount over time, and where this is the business critical loss area here, then you'll want to choose this sort of recovery option. And this option could be a cold site, for example. Summarizing, you've got your option of several different recovery strategies. They're driven by the recovery time frame. How long can you wait before the interruption of the business process becomes unacceptable? Recovering faster costs more. Recovering very, very quickly costs a lot. Recovering within 20 minutes is an extremely expensive process. If you're a credit card processing company like Visa, though, you have to do it because the losses will just become insane in a very short amount of time if you don't. Very quick recovery costs much more. If you don't need to recover quickly, you don't need to spend quite so much money. And the general options here are hot standby, recovery required in seconds or minutes, a hot site where you've got a spare site with your equipment and your backups there, recovery required in hours. This assumes that if you have the equipment up and powered and you've got current backups, that everything can be restored and operational in a matter of hours. And finally, a cold site, a warehouse or a shell site with basic utilities and connectivity, where your business function and IT operations don't need to be up in a matter of days, where your business can handle the losses for a few days, and as a result you can trade this off by having a less expensive recovery option, a cold site. Your options, by the way, are discussed and determined through the formal business impact analysis. The business impact analysis document is where the analyst goes through the various business processes, determines the time criticality of their processes in the event of failure, and then based on that determines what recovery strategy makes sense. The business impact analysis only looks at time criticality. There are a lot of business processes that have long-run strategic importance to a business, without which over a period of years the business will not survive. However, in a disaster recovery situation, you can put those activities on hold for a few weeks while you're dealing with the more critical operations functions. A general rule is that the more the function has to do with actually maintaining the day-to-day revenue stream and operations of the business, the more critical it is. Things like, say, legal counsel, strategic planning, marketing, etc., are oftentimes the sort of functions that don't require an immediate recovery. If you don't have them for a few days, then your business is not going to fail. If you can't process customer orders or do your financial transactions, in many cases, that is what will bring you under. Now, recovery strategies in terms of business operations, there are several options there. We talked about with hot site, cold site, hot standby, and so forth were IT things. Those were disaster recovery options. Here we're talking about business continuity options. Surviving site is where you have dual business locations, where the one surviving location performs the functions of the other with some degradation of service. You've got like a couple of different headquarter locations, or to a headquarter in a large branch location, and the branch location is large enough that it can perform the critical functions of headquarters. So if one of those fails, the other one takes it over. Self-service, so described by the book, is where you transfer work to an existing branch or location. It's not a surviving site. You don't have two equal sites, but you have, kind of a branch or a lesser site that can handle some of the workload. Internal arrangements are where you use non-work facilities for work arrangements. You've got some facilities that are not normally used for performing critical business functions, and you just kind of turn them into something that will support the functions. A reciprocal agreement is an agreement with another business or organization to support recovery. You might see this more with government and not-for-profits, where Organization A and Organization B, separated by some distance, so presumably they don't get hit by the same disaster at the same time, agree that they'll pick up the slack for the other one, with the notion that if they become the victim, then the other one picks up their slack work. Dedicated alternative sites are company facilities specifically designated for recovery purposes, where you have some extra real estate that is specifically designated as your backup business operations center. Work for home is something that you'll find in situations where you have a lot of telecommuting, or where employees may work independently of a central office. You've got folks who are salespeople or other employees that have the ability to work from home and use their home phone and so forth. It's kind of telecommuting as a recovery strategy. External suppliers is an option. Sometimes suppliers may provide temporary facility staff and other resources for a fee. And then, unfortunately, we have to mention no arrangements, as some low priority functions may not get done during a disaster. You may explicitly decide not to make arrangements for certain things. It's just the folks working in that area go home and sit it out and wait until the business gets back on its feet and the disaster has been abated and normal business functions have resumed. I say unfortunately because sometimes folks do this without realizing, in fact, what they're getting into, and that saving money on disaster recovery isn't really a saving when you, in fact, do have a disaster. Now, legal requirements. I'm going here pretty much by what the book says. Now, Sarbanes-Oxley is discussed in the book, but the text seems to say that there is no specific requirement for disaster recovery business continuity. And just to sort of inform you, Sarbanes-Oxley was a piece of legislation passed in the aftermath of the Enron and WorldCom debacles in the early part of the 21st century. What they did is, reformed, set very strict legal standards for corporate governance, internal controls, and the behavior of auditors in assessing these controls, and it really put management on a hot seat because upper management has to sign off that they understand and acknowledge their control and governance environment. So what Sarbanes-Oxley did was really put a lot of restrictions on what management can do and not do, and really made upper management liable for control deficiencies in terms of governing their own organizations. Sarbanes-Oxley requires a lot of things in terms of internal controls and system integrity and knowing the various processes and so forth. But according to the text and some independent articles I've read, Sarbanes-Oxley doesn't really require explicitly disaster recovery or business continuity. However, when faced with Sarbanes-Oxley or SOX reporting requirements, having to say, in effect, the dog ate my data, I'm sorry guys, but we can't tell you what our financial status is because we had a disaster and our accounting systems are completely lost and unrecoverable, that would likely be a career-ending move. So Sarbanes-Oxley isn't so much a legal restriction as it is establishing a political environment, an environment of accountability where poor excuses like a disaster occurred and we can't tell you what our gross earnings are, or I can't tell you about how much inventory we have in certain key warehouses, would be judged not acceptable. And I've have this nice little article here that says how Sarbanes-Oxley affects your disaster recovery planning, which you're certainly welcome to read. Now, if you're a financial institution, You know, you handle other people's money. And since you are entrusted with other folks' money, you're subject to a plethora of rules and regulations and restrictions, including various disaster recovery requirements. Federal financial institution examination criteria. There's a business continuity planning booklet. These booklets are now available online in kind of an interactive format, which I sort of regret because I like the old Adobe Acrobat format better. You can't easily download these things now. If you're a securities dealer, the National Association of Securities Dealers Rule 3510 and New York Stock Exchange rules also govern requirements for disaster recovery planning. There are standards of civil liability. The above are regulatory standards, legal standards that you have to comply with certain regulations. Civil liability basically means, harm and negligence to third parties, that you're economically liable to compensate folks if they suffer because of your own negligence. And this covers things like, the standard of negligence, standard of care, prudent man doctrine, etc. And the notion here being is, if you suffer through a disaster and some third party, customer, vendor suffers as a result of this, and you haven't followed these standards in terms of planning and having adequate disaster recovery, they could probably sue you legally and may get compensation for their damages because you weren't following a standard of care and so forth in terms of maintaining your own systems. Now, there's a few other areas that get mentioned as well. Power utilities are definitely required to have a disaster recovery plan. Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, adopted Title VII of the Energy Policy Act of 2005. This authorizes FERC to create an Electric Reliability Organization, ERO, which will have the capability to adopt and enforce reliability standards in the United States. So, power companies, again, because you're producing something that is critical infrastructure, have specific regulations from FERC. HIPAA may require organizations handling personal medical information to have a disaster recovery plan for that data. Something else to look at. Again, you can't claim the dog ate my data. HIPAA may not explicitly address DR, but it may be implied and may be elaborated in other regulations. One last thing that was mentioned some years ago is the Federal Corrupt Practices Act, which dealt with laws against using bribery to gain contracts in foreign nations. And part of that act included some sanctions if you did not have adequate disaster recovery. The concern was, again, it's the dog ate my homework excuse. Somebody will say, well, we think that you've been paying bribes to get this business in this, corrupt foreign country. We need to examine your books to see if that in fact has occurred. And they say, oh, well, I'm sorry, we can't let you see this information. There was a mysterious fire in our warehouse and that data all disappeared. So anticipating that, I believe that the Federal Corrupt Practices Act included this. Now, I haven't heard of anybody actually being sanctioned for violating this part of the act, but I'm throwing this out there because it was something that was often raised as a legal issue in disaster recovery. Now, here's a thumbnail sketch of how you plan a disaster recovery business continuity project. Project initiation and management. What are you trying to do? Who's going to be running the project? Define the scope of the project. What business entities, what systems are covered from the get-go. In a lot of environments, you have maybe unrelated corporate entities or minor entities where it's more trouble than it's worth to include them in the first cut of a disaster recovery plan. That is all concerned within the project scope. You figure out what you need to complete the project to actually build the disaster recovery business continuity plan. Figure out who the team members are who are going to be working in the planning effort, and these team members may on an ongoing basis be the disaster recovery team for the enterprise itself. The first steps are kind of the basic, immediate needs is team emergency contact lists and vital records backup. Emergency contact lists are kind of a first thing to have. If a disaster happens, the first thing you have to do is have some ability to message and rally the folks who are charged with keeping the business running, with recovering the critical data processing functions and so forth. So you need to have those contact lists and you need to keep them up to date. Vital records backup is making sure not just that the information in computer systems, but hard copy and other data that's necessary for your business to operate is backed up and stored off-site and is accessible in a disaster. So you need to make sure, before you do any other planning, you need to make sure you've got the people that can be contacted and have the commitment to participate in the event of a disaster, and that the information you need to keep the business running is somewhere that you can get to. You then perform a formal risk analysis and business impact analysis, assess the processes and systems of your organization. What is their time criticality? If this business process, if this system, if this application stopped working, what would the losses to the business look like after 20 minutes, an hour, 4 hours, a day, a week? See which ones have losses that mount very quickly and become very high very soon, and focus on those. Based on this risk analysis and business impact analysis, select a recovery strategy. And once you have your strategy, you will know what sort of services you need to acquire to support that strategy. Hot standby, hot site, warm site, cold site, other arrangements, the arrangements mentioned previously for business recovery. You select and build out the alternate site and make the arrangements for business alternate sites. Document the plan, which is step-by-step. Disaster happens, here's what to do. Test and maintain the plan. A couple of points about all of this is a disaster recovery plan should be documented in a good deal of detail, because chances are people are going to be executing this plan under extremely stressful conditions, under a lot of duress. The people executing this plan may not be the people who wrote the plan, may not be the people familiar with it, may not be your so-called A-team. So the plan has to be documented for somebody who's exhausted, stressed out, and doesn't know what they're doing. The same thing with the recovery strategy. Recovery strategy is based on a risk analysis and a business impact assessment. The business impact assessment is what is the impact of a function not operating. The risk analysis is what is the likelihood of a particular disaster happening, and under what conditions would it be expected to happen. So the risk analysis and business impact analysis occur together. Now, testing your disaster recovery business continuity plan. There are several different types of tests. This, again, assumes that you've gone through the business impact analysis, the risk analysis, that you've selected your team, that you've documented your recovery team. One type of test is just a basic call exercise. Go through the list of contacts for the folks who are on the list to be called in the event of a disaster and help keep things running in an off hour, unannounced. See how many of these folks actually respond and get back with us in a certain amount of time. Not to beat them up if they don't, but to make sure that if they to make sure you know realistically what resources you can expect in the event of a disaster. The thing to realize about disaster planning is you may have a team of 20 people. In a real disaster, maybe at best 10 of those people are going to be available. Folks will be out of town, folks will be otherwise unavailable, and if it's a regional disaster, they're going to be tending to their own family. And stuff happens. I remember a story about a guy who in the middle of a major earthquake figured he had to get to the data center because he was the key person in charge of disaster recovery, and he found out that because of the earthquake and a lack of power, he couldn't get his garage door open, and without the garage door being open, he wasn't going anywhere. So, it's things like that. In a disaster, people who are very diligent, who you'd expect to volunteer at any time for any sort of necessary task, are suddenly unavailable for good reason. There's also a tabletop or walkthrough exercise. This is where you walk through the disaster recovery with everyone who has a role. Just go through the plan in kind of a conference room and simulate the disaster, and then have people discuss what they would be doing next. A scenario-based tabletop exercise is a little stronger than the above, a little more involved. It's where you pretend an emergency has occurred, and then you role play in the meeting. The straight tabletop or walkthrough exercise is just, let's walk through the plan in general. The scenario-based is, hey guys, there's a fire in a data center and everything's shut down. What do we do next? A simulated exercise is where you perform the recovery in a simulated environment. This can be, folks who are designated as part of your disaster recovery team going out to a cold site or a hot site and actually restoring the system, getting it up and running, and testing it to make sure it's operational, and noting as a part of the exercise what went right and what didn't go right so they can do it properly the next time. An actual exercise is where you perform an actual recovery operation, where you actually cut over your production systems to the hot site as part of a scheduled exercise. Caution, do not create a disaster in the process of testing your DR. Sometimes cutting over to a hot site results in your critical business processes being shut down if the hot site isn't really ready to run your business processes. Make sure you do all of the exercises listed above and are very familiar with the risks and your capabilities before you actually try to simulate running your business in a DR environment. And then there's a compact exercise, so-called, where you simulate an actual emergency, where you may include emergency personnel involvement. This is kind of like earthquake days that some of us go through here in California, where you simulate an actual earthquake, and the folks who are supposed to provide emergency services, the volunteers within the organization, are actually expected to do the functions that they would perform if there was a real earthquake. People are supposed to sit under their desks, evacuate out, go to a designated evacuee area, and so forth. Anytime you do a test, write up your evaluation of the results. Come up with suggestions for improving the plan. The purpose of the task isn't to pass or fail. The purpose of the test is to make your plan better. And were your RTO goals met? Were you able to get the systems up and running per the service agreements? In any of these exercises, that's a key part of it, even in the call exercise. The call exercise, you're obviously not recovering systems, but you're getting a sense of who's available and how quickly they respond. And that gives you pretty good insights into how quickly the rest of the process will end up taking. Now, you don't just develop a plan, test it once, and put it on a shelf and hope to keep the auditors at bay and hope you never really have a disaster. You need to maintain your recovery capabilities and your business continuity capabilities. You need to make sure the plan is updated. You need to make sure that staff, not just the designated DR and business continuity staff, but your ordinary business folks who really run the enterprise, are trained and are aware of what they need to do, that there's education, classes and so forth, and that you actually have exercises that involve folks in the training and awareness. You need to maintain the plan itself. It's not a static document. It shouldn't go on a shelf and collect dust. You need to update it regularly. An obvious thing is, if you have contact lists, are the phone numbers correct? Do you have people's cell phones and their home phones? Because sometimes one phone or the other may work when the other one doesn't. Are the lists current? Do you make sure that you replace people when they leave your company with somebody else? Is the list of your applications and your hardware requirements for a cold site or hot site up to date? You don't want to go out to a hot site and find out it's stocked with computers that you got rid of 5 years ago as part of a planned upgrade. Make sure that somebody is responsible for updating the DR plan. If no one is responsible for it, it's not going to happen. Make sure that call lists, contact, hardware, software inventory are current. These are important things to know. Things like addresses, where do you go? If you have a designated recovery facility site, make sure that you've got maps to this site and the maps are current. Update the plan based on the results of exercises and actual disaster situations. Finally, a few other points about maintaining your DR capabilities. Make sure you have an ongoing contingency planning program, a program for business continuity and disaster recovery that ensures that your business can continue functioning in the event of a disaster that shuts down business units or information systems. Make sure that the DR plans and the business continuity plans reflect the current business requirements. It's not just a list of phone number and hardware and software. It's just, what does your business do? How does it operate? Businesses tend to acquire other businesses, enter new product lines, do stuff like that. Make sure that your DR plan reflects the reality of your business. Make sure that you have an ongoing participation of all essential organizational areas in developing and maintaining this plan. You need to get executive buy-in, and executive buy-in means that executives have to wield their authority to ensure that everyone does stuff. An emergency management organization is something that is often essential, a formal organization responsible for the DR and business continuity plan. This is a cross-organizational representation. You want folks from the various parts of the business who play different roles in an actual disaster. Folks from information technology, facilities, the operating units, public relations, because somebody has to talk to the press. If there is a disaster, folks from the press will want to know what's going on with your business. You need folks from PR to deal with that, and so on and so forth. And have these folks assigned responsibilities for emergency response. Yes, it is a second job, but it's a second job that's very important, and hopefully folks will not have to fulfill the responsibilities of the second job very often. There will be very few real disasters called. Designate an emergency operations center where you folks coordinate your emergency actions, even if it's just the living room of an executive, somebody offering up their home, because if all other facilities are out and down, if there's a major citywide flood, an earthquake, a hurricane, a tornado, or some major disaster like that, your primary business facility may be down, and a lot of the places that you would otherwise consider as emergency operation centers may be down or are otherwise preoccupied. So make sure that your disaster plans include a location from which the activities of disaster recovery are all coordinated.